There's less information about school-aged kids, but let me tell you what we know. 2 of these are UBC master's theses. So pathway study. This is Tracy Lamb's master's thesis from last year. So remember the one from China looked at pragmatic language in young kids and found it, it wasn't negatively affected? They used tests of pragmatic language development. But pragmatic language can also be assessed by having kids tell stories and analyzing the stories or the narratives, okay? So for example, here's a story. She got Toby on the weekend. You know a lot about everything reading that story, don't you? No. You don't know who she is. You don't know who Toby is. You don't know why she got him. You don't know how she feels about getting him. You don't know very much at all, right? So this is a story that that reflects poor pragmatic understanding, right? You don't have a lot of details here. Here's a story, though. My friend Lisa got a cat on the weekend. She named the cat Toby. She's so happy because she's wanted a cat for a long time, right? Same story, but not same story. Because now you know who Lisa is, who Toby is, how Lisa feels, what get means, how Lisa feels about getting Toby, and why she's feeling that way, right? So this story reflects better pragmatics than the first story. Does that make sense? Okay. So in Tracy's study, she basically used an instrument that provided pictures that didn't have any print to them, and the kid was supposed to tell a story from the pictures. And then she measured the quality of the stories that kids told and was able to look at the quality of the stories and code the quality with regard to how good the kid's pragmatic understanding was. Does that make sense? Okay. So she had 22 monolingual kids, 22 bilingual kids. Again, these now are older kids, 8.5 to 9 years old. They were matched on a bunch of different measures. She used a parent report measure, the Children's Communication Checklist, and this is the measure that allows the child to tell a story while looking at pictures. And she both coded the stories and coded the result. She did a couple of things with that measure. Anyway, punchline. No differences between monolingual and bilingual kids on either the CCC2 or the Ernie score in a whole bunch of different ways. Again, you see sometimes the bilingual is a little bit higher, but again, it's not significantly different. That is, it could have occurred by chance. So again, we see exactly what we saw in the Chinese study, right? There's no pragmatic advantage of being in a bilingual home, but there doesn't seem to be a disadvantage either. And with regard to the great debate, of course, no disadvantage is good news for families, because, right? So that's Tracy's study. This is Stephanie Macaro's thesis, again from the Pathways database, again from UBC, and she looked at executive functions in monolingual and bilingual kids. Executive functions are things like cognitive flexibility, inhibition, working memory, and planning skills. And there is some research suggesting, again, in typically developing kids, that bilingual kids have an advantage with regard to executive function. Because if you have 2 languages in your head, and now you're speaking to a person who only knows one of those languages, you have to monitor yourself to not speak the other language, right? You have to I have to inhibit my Italian to only speak English. because you only know English. But now you know Italian, so now I have to inhibit my English to only, you see what I mean? So there's executive function and memory and all of that kind of stuff involved in the code switching between the languages. We also know that strong executive function skills are fundamental to successful academic performance, particularly with regard to math and reading achievement in typically developing kids. So Stephanie was interested in answering the question, well, maybe there's a bilingual advantage for kids with autism in executive function, which is, again, a big difficulty area for them if they're raised in bilingual homes. She had 21 monolingual kids, 21 bilingual kids, again, 8.5 to 9. They were matched on a number of measures. Their parents completed a measure called the BRIEF, the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Functions, that measures a whole bunch of different executive functions. The kids completed a measure of academic achievement called the Wyatt, that tests word reading, numerical operations, and spelling.
There's a difference.
No. Both the parents and the teachers completed the brief, by the way. And while the parent and teacher briefs didn't necessarily agree with each other, because the parents and the teachers see the kids in two different contexts, so you wouldn't actually expect them to agree with one another, neither one of them were, kids in bilingual homes didn't do worse or better on the brief by parent or teacher report, and they didn't do better or worse on the Wyatt. So their academic achievement was the same in the monolingual and bilingual groups. Their executive function was in the same. In fact, the bilingual group, again, scored slightly, but non-significantly higher, which is good. It's good to score higher. It means you had more executive function. But again, it wasn't significantly different, right? So if it looks like maybe if there had been a larger sample, it might have reached significance, and that might have been, but these are all small sample studies, okay? So, I mean, the punchline here, I think, is that it is extraordinarily rare in the world of research in general and autism research in particular for studies that have looked at the same issue from a bunch of different angles to 100% agree with each other. I mean, that like never happens. It just happened, right? There is absolutely no research suggesting that there is a disadvantage to families to speak more than one language to their kid with autism at home. And in fact, if you want your kid to learn the second language, you better be speaking the second language to him at home. Doesn't mean that he's going to learn it, but pretty much if you don't, then he's not gonna, right? And I think it's really important to get this information out, right? For those of you who are professionals, if you're making the error, stop it. For those of you who are parents, if people are telling you this, show them my handout. You know, that's why I gave you all the references at the end of the handout. It's why I've given you all the detail. Show them the handout. Honest to gosh, there's nothing that I've kept from you. It's not like the studies that showed a bilingual disadvantage, I just didn't bother to include. I looked yesterday just to make sure nothing had come out since I did the handout, right? And you've actually got the advantage that many people don't, because 3 of these studies, the House, the Lamb, and the Macaro study, haven't even been published yet. I just happen to know about them because they came from UBC. So I think it's really important to get this information out and make families feel much more comfortable about speaking naturally and speaking bilingually or trilingually even to their kids with autism, knowing that it is not going to hurt their English language development if they do so. I want to acknowledge all of the people who have contributed, especially to the UBC studies. Stefka Marinova-Todd was the advisor for both Stephanie and Tracy's study, and has been a tremendous collaborator along with her colleague Paola Coloso in the School of Audiology and Speech Sciences. These are all the students whose work you've just heard about. Again, I want to acknowledge the Pathways study, which is now that we have enough data to actually be able to do longitudinal work, is starting to produce some very interesting information about what we think are very important topics. And as I said, in your handout, you've got all the references, so if anybody asks you where you heard all this crazy information, you can point them to these published studies. Thank you.